This is Beyond Busy. I'm Graham Alcott. I'm the author of a number of books, including the global bestseller How to Be a Productivity Ninja, and I'm the founder of Think Productive. We help people to make space for what matters and get more done, and we partner with some of the world's leading companies who share our mission to transform the world of work. Beyond Busy is where I explore the often messy truths and contradictory relationships around topics like work-life balance, happiness and success, and explore with interesting people what makes them tick. In short, this is where we ask the bigger questions about work. My guest today is Greg Hoffman. Greg spent many years in one of the coolest jobs in the world as Chief Marketing Officer for Nikey. He's also the author of a new book about his experiences, Emotion by Design. In this episode, we talk about some of the marketing campaigns that took Nikey to another level, the importance of emotion and empathy in business, why diversity increases productivity, and at the end, he shares a bit about finding his birth parents just last year. This is Greg Hoffman. So, Greg Hoffman, welcome to Beyond Busy. How are you?
I'm doing well, thanks. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
And we were just talking off air there that I'm catching you the day before your your book launches in the US, and then obviously is going to launch in the UK shortly after that. So I guess you are pretty busy right now.
That's right, but it's a good kind of busy, right? So keeps you energized, and I couldn't be more happy to share these thoughts and this methodology with the world.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, so the book is called Emotion by Design. If you're watching this on YouTube, you'll get a little picture of the book cover there. So Emotion by Design: Creative Leadership Lessons from a Lifetime at Nikey. So I'm in the UK. So my first question is a really frivolous first question, right? Which is it wrong to say Nike? Because I grew up calling it Nike. Am I wrong?
It is Nike, but at some point a brand belongs to the people. So how you choose to say it is up to you. And I think that's perfectly fine. And I'm not going to stand in the way of that. So
do you know part of the reason I wanted to ask you that question is that just having read the book, I actually thought you might have something really interesting to say about it rather than just saying, no, we pronounce it Nike. Just because I think there is...
Truth is, as kids growing up I don't want to date myself, but I will, certainly in the late 70s, early 80s, in the US, a lot of people said Nike.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Oh, so there you go. One of the reasons it's interesting is that you talk a lot in the book about the emotional connection that brands have. And so with Nikey, I mean, it felt really romantic, that first part of the book where you're talking about your own first interactions with the brand, and then that kind of realization that there was something really, really creative in the design process of those ads. Do you want to just tell us that story of how did you first come across Nikey as a brand, and then that first opportunity to get involved and actually work for the company?
Yeah, absolutely. And, as a kid having two dominant passions, art and sport, at that point in my life. And so obviously when I saw this brand able to intersect these two passions, it was a revelation for me. And so really it started first with product. My first Nike shoe was an Air Force One High that I had as a freshman in high school. But really when I started to feel these, back to this idea of stirring emotion, in terms of how the brand tells stories. It was really the 1984 Olympics. I was a long jumper. So I was a huge Carl Lewis fan at the time. And here was this brand doing this I Love LA commercial because it was the LA Olympics. And here's Randy Newman, the singer, driving around in a convertible. And as he's going through town, he's seeing, Carl Lewis is coming out of frame and into the frame, jumping onto the sand in Santa Monica. You have other athletes. And I was just blown away. And that was really that start of, okay, this is something greater than just products, right? This is kind of a state of mind or a way one would live their life, right? And this is even before Just Do It. So that was kind of that early point. And then obviously the introduction of Just Do It in 1988, with the Bo Knows ad, Bo Jackson playing multiple sports. That just sealed the deal for me. And then finally, in college, I had the Michael Jordan Wings poster on my wall, right, with his arms outstretched and a William Blake quote underneath that said, no bird soars too high if they soar with their own wings. So that's quite powerful. But I'll have you know, even a year before I arrived at Nike, I didn't even know that Nike was in Portland, Oregon. I'm growing up in the middle of America in Minnesota. So that I had grasped the concept of how a brand can play a deeper role in a person's life, but I didn't put it together that there was an actual department working together to create these emotions, right? So just a little background on that journey.
And like when you first got there, so you talk about the year was 1992, and it's an interesting era for me because it's probably like the first era that I really remember, kind of watching sports. So you had like the Summer Olympics with the Dream Team, you had Andre Agassi at Wimbledon, and there was this huge. I remember really vividly the controversy that happened the year before when Andre Agassi was at Wimbledon and he was wearing too many colours on his outfits, and the Wimbledon hierarchy were trying to make him wear all white. So the next year, what does he do? Like turns up in complete all white with just the Nike logo on. So like it was a really, and then there's the Derek Redmond story, which maybe you can tell, but it was a really incredible sort of period of time, that kind of early 90s era in terms of just what was going on in music and fashion and sport. Like everything seemed to be very exciting at that time.
No question. Absolutely, it was a summer of sport to remember. And for someone like myself, who had such a big affinity for Michael Jordan, and the fact that not only did he win the NBA championship that summer against, the Portland Trailblazers, the beloved team of the city that I was going to work at, and then to follow that up for the first time, professional NBA athletes could play in the Olympics, which essentially was the formation of the first dream team. And I have a chapter later on in the book about creating a creative dream team, right? But it really kind of comes from that idea of bringing together the best players in the world onto one team, and how do you create the type of chemistry that's needed to create great work and great wins. But so yes, it was just a magical summer, and certainly that swoosh, seeing it for the first time on a cap that Agassi was wearing, actually a couple years later would lead to the brand making the decision to go swoosh only as its brand trademark. Because up until that time, it was only on product that you saw the swoosh. But in communication and in the stores and on posters, it was still the swoosh with Nike Futura Bold typeface above it that said Nike. So just a quick story there in terms of how a brand transitioned and simplified its brand, the core of its brand identity. And the rest is history from there.
Yeah, and just to ask a little follow up to that. So the thing with Derek Redmond feels quite similar. Do you want to just tell the story of Derek Redmond for those that don't remember?
Yeah, it's just the embodiment of Just Do It to me. And Derek Redmond was a sprinter, and he was actually not a Nike athlete, right? But Derek Redmond, as he turned the corner in his race in front of millions of people, around the world watching this, he pulled up, and I believe he pulled his hamstring, if I recall. And at first kind of came to a stop, just a slight walk. But his father came out of the stands, and his father was actually wearing a Just Do It cap, and came up to him, put his arm around his shoulder, and walked him all the way to the finish line. And it's one of those moments that brings tears to your eyes because you can feel the journey that the athlete's taken and how that's in some ways taken away from him. But at the same time, between the two of them, they're giving so much to the world in that moment, right? You talk about this idea of empathy, and it's brought to life before your very eyes. And it was just one of those unique moments that just reinforced the idea of defying convention and just doing it, no matter what the circumstances, you know. So yeah, it really stands out for me as a natural moment that happened, that captivated a lot of attention at the time.
Yeah, and I suppose my curiosity with that was, so there's that moment, there's the Agassi thing, which, again, in some ways kind of feels like this moment that just happens and it sort of captures the imagination. And like that one obviously feels a bit more designed than Derek Redmond, but there's an element of kind of accident to all of it, isn't there? Where you have to work out and see which things are going to really strike people at the heart and which things are not. So, like, would you say that part of the creative process is to just do lots of those things and see what sticks, or is there like a bit more of a science to how to engineer those kind of moments that are going to really create connection?
Well, I think it's yes. There's moments that are not in your control, obviously, that are, and sometimes we call those happy accidents. But as a team and an individual, you have to be prepared for those moments as well. And you have to have the level of curiosity and, vision for what's happening in the outside world, so that when that moment happens, you're ready to leverage that. And back to this idea of sport, there is always a calendar of sport moments that's happening. And so part of creativity is, to your point, planning for those moments and planning for a win. Don't wait for the win to happen, right? Because that is not a recipe for success. And so oftentimes, I certainly, with the teams that I had the privilege of leading, we would create bodies of work. And essentially, you're predicting how certain events and moments might happen, or when someone might become the leading goal scorer, or when another team might advance to the next round of a particular tournament. So, you can't be complacent. Complacency is the enemy of creativity, in my opinion. And as soon as we stop being curious and start getting comfortable, your creativity starts to atrophy. And so I think that's very important for creatives and marketers of all ages to continue to find ways to keep themselves energized and motivated in a world that, quite frankly, is moving far faster now than it was, to your point, back in 1992.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny, isn't it, to sort of think back now to all the other things in terms of what the world looked like around those sporting events compared to the next World Cup. Let's think about some of the lessons from the book then. So one of the ones that really struck me, and partly because I'm writing this book about kindness and leadership at the moment, was around empathy. And there's a lovely line in the book where you say the first element of every inspiring idea comes from empathy. What did you mean by that?
Well, if you think about whether you're designing a product or whether you're concepting a campaign or a piece of communication or a story, it's only going to be as strong as the insight or truth that you start with. And when you start a process, you're only going off of assumptions and observations, right? Basically, what everyone else already sees. And that's why when I think of empathy, the principle I like to use is this idea of see what others see, find what others don't. And I think creative people inherently have this gift because it's part of the creative process. So at the beginning, are you digging deep? Are you peeling back the layers to get to something that's quite sharp as an insight and revealing that. So then the process becomes, how do you reveal that in the most profound way to move people? And I'll give you a quick example that I think would relate, that a lot of the listeners could relate to. There was a pretty historic Nike campaign that, again, I had the privilege of working on, which was Find Your Greatness. Back in 2012 for the London Olympics is when that launched. And imagine how powerful it was when we kicked that process off, when a creative director from the agency Wieden Kennedy came into the room and said, did you know that there are 25 other cities and towns around the world called London? And within those towns, large and small, there's other people having their own Olympics and trying to achieve their potential as athletes and reach their dreams. That's quite powerful as a creative team when someone started with empathy, went deep, did the research, was curious, and kind of not only, it's like, if you keep that to yourself, then you're not lifting the entire team. So I think the other part of empathy is not only with your subject, whether it's an individual, a community, or a city, but also for your own team in terms of how you share and inspire them. And when you get an entire team exercising and strengthening their empathy, I think the creative output is just has so much more potential.
Yeah, and there's something else that you said as well in the book, which I didn't write down, so I'm going to attempt to paraphrase, but it's something like, don't try and tell the story of the brand about the brand, but use the brand to tell a story about the person who's consuming the brand. So that feels like a really important part of Nike's success, right? Is like it leads people to feel inspired about themselves and to express their sort of ownership of the brand in a really different way, which is why it becomes this huge thing for, music culture as well as just in sport and so on. Like, that feels like a really hard thing to do, though. So, like, how did that? Can you tell a bit more of a story about how did that approach start at Nike? And also, like, for someone listening to this, even if you don't work in marketing, like, how can you kind of use some of those techniques to really benefit your own work?
It's a great question and great point, and I have no problem admitting, because that the early parts of my career, and oftentimes when you think of branding and brand management, so much of it is about how you want the consumer and the audience to feel about your brand, right? In some ways, it's very one way. You're trying to create an impression in their mind of your brand and your brand image. But I think the great brands, the ones that truly transcend, kind of move into a place where they spend just as much time thinking about how they want people to feel about themselves when they interact with your brand, and in turn, their ability to feel empowered to reach their dreams and potential. And so if you as a team, I don't care if you're a business of 6 people or 600, if you can make that transition, and it really kind of moves you from kind of being, marketing to serving, and this idea of being with people for the long term, not just for the moment, right? Like, you're a brand that is about progression. This idea of we're here to have a relationship and help you on your journey, just like we help athletes on the pitch or the track or the court. So I think part of it, Graham, is it always starts with the mindset. How are we playing the game? And we're going to be, we're certainly going to spend time shaping the brand in ways that, position our brand in the world within our category in a way that's distinct and create separation from the competition. We know that that's a dominant part of what branding is. At the same time, back to this idea of emotion by design, you have to stir those levels of emotion and resonate in a deeper way in people's lives so you can help them and empower them more so than just being in a relationship that, quite frankly, is transactionary.
And I guess it's sort of the hero's journey equivalent thing of you're Yoda, not Luke Skywalker, right? Like you're there as the guide to show them what they're doing rather than to be the hero the whole time.
That is correct, and it's a again, it's a conversation. It's not a broadcast. And even better when you get to a point where it's not only a conversation between the brand and the audience, but the audience then it can, because as I said in the book, at some point the stories you tell no longer belong only to you as a brand. They get passed down and into culture, if you will, and reinterpreted for every generation. And I think that's the beauty of Just Do It. Just Do It. It's rare that not only a slogan, but a way of communicating Just Do It through stories and advertising over the years has appealed to multiple generations. It's almost this, obviously sport, like music, has the power to unify people, no matter how different they are. And I think the way that Just Do It is brought into the world every single year accomplishes that in a very inspiring way.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm just kind of thinking in my head about my own company and some of the ways that we can employ some of those techniques in our own marketing. There's quite a lot in the book that really speaks to sort of lessons around leadership rather than just around branding. So I'd just love to talk about some of those. And I love the bit where you talk about, you sort of allude to the Apple Here's to the Crazy Ones campaign, and talk about the real need for surrounding yourself with visionaries, making it okay for visionaries to be part of your culture. But then there's this bit that sort of counters it, which says, let the quiet ones speak the loudest. Do you want to just talk about that?
Well, yeah, and certainly when my retirement speech, if you will, at Nike 2 years ago, what I asked the folks that were gathered in the room is to really three communities that I had an affinity for, but I also saw myself within those groups. The first, of course, is those daydreamers, the right brain thinkers, and the second group are the quiet ones, the introverts, who oftentimes get excluded because they're not exercising their voice loud enough in the moment. And my point to the group is that oftentimes you're missing out on the stories that they have to tell. And you're talking about individuals that oftentimes want some time to process what they're hearing. And certainly in the creative arena, imagine the power of allowing individuals the time to go back, think about what they heard, synthesize that, and come back in a way, sometimes being able to visualize that and surprise the greater team and organization in a way that creates momentum and delivers new innovation and new ideas. But oftentimes they're excluded or ignored because just having a loud voice doesn't mean it's right. Okay. And I just think oftentimes brands are missing out when oftentimes the daydreamers are a bit difficult to work with. Oftentimes introverts are a little bit hard to interpret, right? Like, are you in the game or not? They just might be a little bit uncomfortable, right? And then, of course, diverse voices and those that, quite frankly, have had numerous barriers or bias to work through to be in the room. But yeah, I mean, look, it took a long time for me over the years to find my voice because so much of my early career was speaking through my work, right? And that's how I was able to contribute. And it was only when I started to manage teams and those teams grew, I really had to figure out how I was going to still stay true to who I was, and at the same time, because oftentimes you're working within a highly competitive business environment, right? You're working around extroverts, right? Who it comes very easy to speak in the moment. And so I would say to anybody, it's a journey, and you need to. It's something that requires commitment and work, but you should never, be someone you're not, right? And so it does take a management team, though, to recognize the power of the quiet voices. Certainly in the field of innovation and creativity, you are leaving a massive business advantage on the table if you are not taking advantage of those voices.
Yeah, and like you say, it's also the introverts are often the ones who are the reflective thinkers, and so they're the ones who they go away and they distill everything, and then they come back and reflect it back to you in maybe a different way, and that requires like you've got to listen and more proactively listen, but also it requires a bit more time as well, right? Because you need that time to reflect, and in an organization that's loud and fast paced, like how do you do that? What did you learn in terms of managing people that allowed you to to really not leave those talents on the table?
Yeah, well, one of the things I since I got to Nike, I believed in this idea of just like with sports, I think the most dominant teams have two traits that are really prevalent within their offense, and it's speed and agility. The agility part we talked about, right? Anticipating what might happen and being able to change direction in the moment and deliver that win, if you will. The speed is this idea of being able to um, visualize and prototype ideas with great speed. And now more than ever, that's really important considering how fast everything is moving. And so early on, myself and the teams I led, um, our role in a lot of those meetings was to take what we heard, but come back. Because how many times have you been in a conversation and said, that idea we talked about 3 months ago, whatever happened to that? And people say, oh, I'm not sure. It's like, I guess we got too busy. And then a year later, someone's like, well, what happened to that idea? So I wanted to eliminate that, right? And so our role oftentimes was to participate in those conversations, but go back, visualize the end in mind. What's that vision look like? Come back to the team and create this kind of vivid expression of what was discussed, and then prototype it, take it to market and test it. And so over time, then what starts to happen is those invitations by the teammates start coming more frequently because everyone sees the power of, okay, I get it. I see that there's certain individuals that need to just soak up what's going on in the moment. They go back, reflect on that, as you said, and then use the power of design thinking and creativity to come back and rally everybody. It's quite powerful. That's why I have that kind of that principle of what's the movie poster of the idea. Because if you think of a movie poster, you need to get the concept. It needs to hook you in that moment. And so oftentimes that's what we were trying to do. And what it did is it shifted the culture of recognizing that a lot of folks just process information in a different way, maybe at a different speed, but are equally, if not more important within the process of, building new ideas and taking them to market. So that's just kind of one way teams can think about how to unlock those different communities within your brand.
And just develop that idea around managing teams and leading teams. So you touched on diversity a few minutes ago, and so just wanted to talk about that. So you took in the book about the idea of diversity is oxygen. And I know you had a lot of very leading roles within Nike in terms of advising the Black community of workers within Nike as well. So do you want to just start with, just want to ask you a couple of questions on that theme. Let's just start with just diversity in general. What do you think is the main, kind of benefit of diversity? Like why do you see that diversity is oxygen?
Different life experiences and perspectives in the room coming together has a greater probability of leading to something that is not only unique to the market conceptually, but will ultimately provide access and opportunity to communities that, quite frankly, don't have that access. And so it works both ways. Not only do you have a greater chance of having the type of dialogue and conversation and teamwork between individuals within a diverse team, but you have a greater chance of broadening the consumers and the audience that you serve. So it's also a huge business advantage because it leads to business growth. And, for me, as someone who grew up as mixed race, half Black, half white, I was also adopted into a white family. And I grew up in a white school system and had quite a bit of adversity within that. But what it did do is it just motivated me to use my platform and position at any point within my career to help those that maybe had the same experience, and make sure that the teams that I led were a mirror or a reflection of the audiences that we were either serving or we needed to serve and provide access to.
Yeah, and I suppose that's the thing, isn't it? So I'm a passionate believer in diversity just from the point of view of that's the right thing to do and social justice, but also when you think about it from the point of view of the results that you get, it's like I read a really interesting thing with Warren Buffett talking about feminism a few years ago, where he basically said, we've got, good feminism is actually about saying, well, let's utilize all the best skills that we have, and if you're not actually involving women in some of the top leadership positions, well, you've just got 50% of the population not contributing as much as they could do, and that's just not good business then, sort of thing. So I think there's something really important in making that argument, isn't there, to say that actually it is important for social justice, but it's also really good for creativity and productivity and getting results.
You're exactly right. And that's why it was really important for me to actually show versus just tell, to ensure that I was using my own journey and my own outlook at the world, but also demonstrate it through some iconic campaigns, products, and experiences. Because oftentimes diversity is just looked at by the numbers, right? And you could have a diverse team, but you haven't unlocked the potential of that team. Because the whole point is to this idea of what I call living the personal in the professional, allowing the individual experience and perspective of those diverse individuals to come out within the business and brand and creative process, right? And that's where you see some of those examples of the type of work that it leads to, and the type of impact it not only has in people's lives, but also in culture. And that's that idea of being able to spark a movement, right? And have the type of meaning in culture and in people's lives where they feel they want to collectively come together to change the world for the better.
And you talk early on in the book about the culture at Nike, and the three words that you use is collaboration, inclusion, and creativity. And it feels like all of those in their own ways are really important for what we're talking about. So what are some of the ways that Nike would build that culture? Like, what are some of the particular things that, if you're a manager working in a really different organization, what can you learn from how Nike does collaboration and inclusion and creativity?
Well, I talk a lot about this idea of breaking people out of their silos. I think it's really, really important. And even if you just try this as a project, is to get everyone to, in some ways, virtually or physically sit together, regardless of what their department or division is responsible for. And I do use an example in the book, and one I used with my team many, many times, is the example of FC Barcelona and their approach to football through this idea of tiki-taka. And if you think about that, it's pretty amazing. It's this idea of a lot of these short passes. First being unselfish and passing the ball as a teammate, and at the same time making sure you're always moving and in position with everyone else. And I think that's where we had a lot of success in this idea of radical creative collaboration, where everyone is aware of what their position is, but they also have the opportunity to. There's room for improv. There's room for spontaneity. That you have enough structure and enough coaching where people know where they need to be, but they also have the opportunity to bring back to the point of diversity, bring some of themselves into that process as well. And so that's why I say often, it's like pass the ball and shorten the passes, because if you're in a culture of collaboration where there's a lot of waiting for approval, waiting for permission, long handoffs, sometimes days, right? Versus this synchronicity and this chemistry where people are moving around the field together. I think it's important sometimes for coaches and managers to use metaphors or symbols to get their team in the right place. And the other, just to kind of keep going, is the other example I use a lot is the Brazil national team. And it's certainly a team that I got to work with over almost 3 decades, right? And what I was always struck by Brazil through their style of play, Jenga, is it really was this playbook where the individual was celebrated. What made them unique was celebrated. And Graham, even if Brazil was frustrating you as a fan for 90 minutes, at one point within that game, there would be something brilliant.
It's so true.
Because
Yeah.
that was their point. They played beautifully
Yeah.
and won at the same time. And I think there's a lot of parallels to the creative process within that. If it's too rigid and there's too much structure, people can't create beautifully. They
Yeah.
can't flex and improv within that.
Yeah, and I love those two ideas sitting alongside. So the Barcelona tiki-taka is, it's very team orientated, and I love that bit in there of it's about the awareness of where everybody else is and what everybody else is doing. I think that's such an important thing in management that we often lose sight of in leadership roles because we've got our own bit to do, right? And so we're not having that awareness of what's happening elsewhere. And then almost like the Brazilian thing feels like the opposite, right? It's like the sort of explode with something really beautiful, and and don't apologize for expressing yourself. I really love that. One of the ideas in the book which really struck me is best explained by me asking you, how many photos have you got on your iCloud account?
It is in 80,000 range. Okay.
Right.
And no, I'm sure my laptop is just dying, or my iCloud. I hope I don't. I don't know how many times I've had to upgrade my storage capacity in my iCloud account.
Apple must love you. But yeah, tell us about
I
that.
think so. But but here's the deal. I talk about that idea of just, if empathy is what finds the insight in the truth, it's inspiration that reveals it, right? It's how you take that truth and express it to the world, whether it is a product or a service or an experience. Um, and it's so important to get outside yourself, look outside your business sector. I can't emphasize this enough. So much of innovation within storytelling or product design, etc., comes from transference from other business sectors. The great story of Nike Air. Nike Air might be the most significant innovation in Nike's history, and that actually came from a NASA engineer, that was, innovating for space exploration, and coming up with ways to create astronaut helmets. And the idea that he came to Nike with this idea, and that Nike embraced that because they understood that you need to always be open and seeking inspiration from other areas. And so that led to Nike Air, a revolution in footwear cushioning. So there are many other examples within that as well. But for me, it's not only about finding inspiration and capturing it. I think you need to have a way as a team of bringing that inspiration back inside an organization, organize it in a way where everyone might have access to it, right? And it becomes this energy source to not only your team, but the entire brand. It's quite powerful if everybody has that, that seeking mentality. And I think your probability to find new ideas and introduce new things within the world that your audience lives within goes way up. And look, Graham, we're not all naturally curious, but I do think curiosity is like a muscle. I think you can exercise that. And I think it's also really important, not only do I have way too many photos and screenshots from my phone of things I think are interesting, whether it's a quote or a piece of architecture or a product, etc. But I also try lots of new emerging products and services and innovations. And by using yourself in some ways as a guinea pig, again, just and forcing yourself to do that. So it's like you're trying new products, you're meeting new people, you're having conversations like we are today. You're going to see different things, but make a plan to go out and find it. Because don't wait for inspiration to just hit you by chance.
Yeah, and so you talk in the book about things like, bringing Marie Kondo in to talk about the life-changing art of tidying up, and having a focus on Japan. And there's a lovely bit where you talk about doing these different team building events and making advertising with Las Vegas theme and writing children's books in a few hours and stuff like this. So there's like things that you can do on a leadership level, on a team level, that brings the outside into the organization. But in terms of that sense of your own curiosity, so if curiosity is a muscle and someone doesn't feel as curious, and I'm definitely not as curious to have 80,000 screenshots,
That's a good thing.
It's probably like the hardest question to ask you, because you're obviously naturally curious, and often when someone's really naturally of a skill set, it's hard for them they're like the worst person to teach it. But like if I said to you, like, what's the light bulb that goes off in your head when you're on your phone and you think, oh, I must screenshot that? Like what are the questions, what's the inspiration, what's the thought process that's going on in your head when you make that decision to save something and come back to it later?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes it's not it's twofold. Sometimes it may relate to something that I'm working on. I work with startups today. I sit on a few of those boards. I'm very aware of what we're pursuing to put out into the world. And so I might be looking at, scrolling through my phone, looking at what a different brand has done, or a different startup, or it might be a cooking show where they've introduced something unique to that. Whatever it is, I have this voice that says you need to log that, you need to capture that. And I'll be honest, it's not as organized as I would like it to be, and oftentimes some of it just goes into the air, right? And probably I'll never see it again. But all it takes is one of those um, points of inspiration, and sometimes in a year, I might find 1,000 things in a year that I found interesting. Person, a place, a thing. All it's going to take is one moment. I talk about in the book. I took the team to Savile Row to look at the greatest suit makers on earth. Your neck of the woods, and what we saw there directly inspired a first of its kind, sneaker customization shops. And what started as one shop that we tested in New York over the next few years became customization sneaker shops at all of our flagship stores around the world. But it has to start with the fact that we went looking for inspiration, and we stepped into these fine tailor shops to see the care and the level of service that they took to create essentially suits that were work of art. And we said, well, what if we created that with sneakers? And we didn't just act, again, it gets back to, it's seeking inspiration. It's asking the question, how could this relate to what we're trying to pursue? And then finally, not just talking about it, but doing it. And having a space that's protected to come up with unique ideas, because look, we're all busy. There is a plan. This is business and it's work, and we come to work to execute the business at hand. But on the way to delivering that plan, I think it's really important for managers and coaches to ensure that there's space, whether it's once a month, once a quarter, or once a year, where the team feels motivated and, quite frankly, accountable to deliver ideas that aren't necessarily on the brief. Because look, Graham, if all we're doing is waiting for someone to tell us what to do, how are we going to? Then we're not, I think, exercising some of the inherent traits that we have locked up within us. Sometimes we just don't know that we can be more empathetic, more curious, or more fearless because we haven't been asked or allowed to exercise those traits.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, there's something in there about space which maybe just segues us on to the last question I want to ask you. So the book is Emotion by Design, and yeah, just full of just some really great stories. I didn't get to talk to you about LeBron James. I really wanted to tell that story. But the final question, I read that so you said before that you were adopted into a white family, and then I read that you've just recently, in the last year or so, found your original birth families. And I just wondered, you've gone through these two, so the whole world's been going through this experience of COVID, right? But you've had these other two really big experiences, finding your birth family, and then obviously checking out of one of the coolest jobs in one of the coolest brands in the world. And I just wondered, as you've had that space over the last couple of years, what has that space taught you? What are your reflections on the last couple of years?
Yeah, I mean, I had obviously, leaving Nike in February of 2020, had no idea that COVID was about to hit in March, right? And I was preparing to essentially do four things: write, teach, advise, and speak. Share my knowledge, right? With a focus on bringing more diverse representation into the fields of advertising and marketing and design and innovation, which have kind of lagged behind for quite some time. And then fast forward to April of 2021, and I was just minding my own business, actually reading if you can believe it, I was reading the New York Times. The newspapers still work. Okay. And yeah, that's when I got a notification from 23andMe from someone that said that I was her uncle. And within an hour, after some sleuthing in social media, I realized, no, this person is my sister. And not only was she my sister, but she also, I started as a graphic designer. And when I looked at her profile, she was a graphic designer. I looked at the profile further. She went to my high school. So that moment led to an incredible like wave of knowledge and this idea that over my lifetime I had so many questions that were never answered, because you might take it for granted, but why do I look this way I do? Why do I speak this way? Why do I have certain characteristics or passions? And so within the last year, so many of those questions have been answered. And I go forward with just incredible optimism. Even though there's so many, we're everyone's dealing with a lot. Certainly, 2 years of COVID. You have the war going on right now. Everyone's under a lot of pressure. There's a lot of uncertainty. But I also just back to this idea of creativity being able to change the world, and leveraging, the art that we can make together to kind of move this thing forward. I've never been more optimistic about that in my own practice and what I'm doing today professionally, but also with this confidence I kind of have, with the knowledge of understanding where I came from through this discovery of these two families and the generations that go back, and truly finding out where a lot of that creativity comes from. And maybe a lot of that on the other side, where that need to want to engage in the world in a way to kind of back to that idea of break down barriers and provide access for those that are unseen and unheard. So I'm pretty excited about the year ahead, and certainly writing this book is my hope is that it's a catalyst for others to participate in that journey.
Yeah, well, it certainly feels like that, and there's so many stories. I mean, the word I'm kind of left with is stories, and there's so many stories in this book, and you just describe really practically how those stories have changed things in the world. So, just want to say thank you for writing it. And how can people? Obviously, people can go online and buy the book, but where can they connect with you and find out more about what you're doing?
Yeah, you can connect with me on LinkedIn, of course, or you can kind of see what I'm up to through Instagram at GHOFF70. And you can go to either one of my websites, themodernarena.com, kind of talks about what I'm doing from an advising standpoint. And from a book standpoint, you can check out what's happening at emotionbydesign.co. So, and I'm always happy to engage in conversation and certainly share passion for, this creative space that we all live within. And by the way, I just want to be clear, we all have the capacity to be creative within this process, right? Because I think sometimes a lot of us think, well, I'm not creative. And that's just not the case when you think about the types of ideas at scale we're trying to put out in the world. We all need to participate in that.
For sure. Really inspiring. Just Greg, thank you so much for being on Beyond Busy.
Thank you, Graham. It's been a pleasure.
This video is sponsored by Think Productive, home of the Productivity Ninja. We help people and organizations to increase their impact and make space for what matters through a range of workshops, programs, and coaching. Head to thinkproductive.com to find out more. Are you interested in booking me as a speaker for your event? You want to sign up for my Rev Up for the Week email? Do you want to buy some of my books? Or do you just want to find out what I'm doing right now? It's all at grahamalcott.com/links. And if you like this video, please like, subscribe, and share so we can make more. Thanks for watching.